Welcome. My name is Brian. I am also one of the pastors here, and we've been on this Journey with Jesus series for the last 4 or 5 weeks now. And what we're doing is we're simply following in the footsteps of Jesus as he travels across different terrains. And so we found Jesus in a lush Jordan Valley with water. We found him out in the dry wilderness in the desert. We found him in busy streets in Galilee. Last week we found him up on a mountain where God's glory shined upon his son. He had his friends there with him. This week we're going to travel to a garden. And when you think of a garden, right, you think of something beautiful, something with life. But this is a different kind of garden. It's a garden called Gethsemane. This garden is actually down in a dark valley. And it's filled with olive trees. And if you don't know about olive trees, they're not the most beautiful. They're kind of gnarled and knotted and just kind of wicked looking. Actually, the word Gethsemane means olive press. And so this is a garden. It's kind of fitting that Jesus goes to Gethsemane, the olive press, where he begins to feel the weight and the pressure of humanity's sin drawing upon him. Now, on our journey with Jesus, we're moving towards Easter. We've got this week, next week, and then our Easter weekend. And again, invite friends and family to one of those 2 Easter services. We're going to have room because we're doing 2 services and it's going to be a spectacular night. We've already started working on the music for those services, the messages for those services. They'll be identical almost, except for the second service. The last half will be acoustic because they're doing yoga next door, so we got to keep it a little more quiet. But it'll be special, and sometimes acoustic is beautiful anyway. So just want to encourage you, be here that weekend, mark the calendars. But we're walking now with Jesus into that finality. And so when we find ourselves in the garden, first Sunday, Jesus came into Jerusalem, and it's his final entry into Jerusalem. And that's what David's actually going to talk about next week. On Monday, there's more finality. It's his final visit to the temple. He flips over the tables, if you remember. Not so Christians in the future could use this as an excuse to be jerks, but to draw attention and to hasten the inevitable that was to come. On Tuesday, it's Jesus' final day, not of teaching, but his final day of public teaching. Wednesday, he kind of rests, and then by Thursday, it's his final meal, that Passover meal, his final bite of bread, his final sip of wine. And from that final meal in that upstairs room, where it's filled with the smell of bread and lamb and those bitter herbs, and yes, even those sweaty bodies of his friends, we're told this in Matthew 26, verse 36. Then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to them, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee. If you don't know who those 2 sons are, it's James and John, along with him. And he began to be sorrowful and troubled. He began to be sorrowful and troubled. Jesus often, when he prayed, would go away from everyone, and he would meditate, and he would spend time with the Father, and he would just get away from everybody and everyone. But on this night, something is different. He's taken with him his 3 closest friends. And so my first point tonight is I just want to say, as a friend, show up. By instinct, we humans, we want somebody by our side in a moment of crisis. Maybe it's the hospital the night before surgery, or maybe it's the funeral of a loved one. I know after 9/11, a national tragedy, I just wanted to be around other people, not for any purpose other than to just have other people around me, even if those friends do nothing other than to be present. And that's what Jesus wants. I know for me, on really rough days, sometimes I'll call Karen and say, "Hey, do you want to go to lunch?" Not so she can counsel me, which she gives me plenty of counseling, or not so she can give me a pep talk. I just want her to be present. That's it. Somebody to be with me so I can just sit and mope through my lunch, but get through it. Being a friend isn't always about the words that you use. Sometimes it's simply showing up so that that other friend doesn't have to be alone. Sometimes that's why we show up in this place. It's not for you, it's for those who are around you. Verse 38 says, "Then he said to them, 'My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me.'" We all have that friend who likes to exaggerate things, right? You know that friend that I'm talking about? Like everything in their life is a big deal. My family says that's me. That's debatable. But I think it's my wife, Karen, because our house, when it's 75 degrees, she's like, it's freezing in here. And so we turn it up to 76 degrees. She's like, I'm melting in here. Everything's a big deal. It's an exaggeration. Jesus is not that person. We look at his life and his ministry, he is not known to exaggerate. And so here, suddenly, Jesus begins to be troubled. He starts to experience what he says is soul-crushing grief and sorrow, and that is not an exaggeration. Why? Why at this moment, as he prepares to go to his Father in prayer, does his soul feel crushed? That's the question we ought to be asking as we read this text. Why is Jesus right now coming apart at the seams? Why is he unraveling, it says, to the point of death? Verse 39, going a little further, Jesus fell with his face to the ground. This isn't a pretty scene. This isn't Jesus, going off with his little devotional book, a cup of coffee, some quiet time with the Father, posting it on Instagram. This is knees buckling, throat tightening, unable to continue until he falls face first, prostrate to the ground. And then it says he prayed, my Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. I want to tell you, this is not a formal prayer. This is not our Father who art in heaven, where Jesus is teaching his disciples how to pray. These are no pious words. This is someone overwhelmed with anguish and torment and grief, pleading with his Father, take it away. Luke's gospel adds the sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground to underpin the severity of this prayer. There is a great struggle underway here with Jesus, but what is that struggle? I mean, is it because he's afraid of the pain that is about to be bestowed upon him? Is it because he's got fear of death? Perhaps. I mean, Jesus is fully God, but he's also fully human. And so I imagine that he no more relished pain and death than you or I do, but there is something else. If it were only pain, if it were only death, well, it wouldn't be in keeping with how we've seen the Spirit work through other strong believers over the course of history. I'll give you just 3 examples. Polycarp, he's one of John's disciples, an early disciple in the Christian church, one of the first Christian martyrs. He was put to death by being burned alive. And as he's being burned alive, he is steadfast. He prays the entire time he is burning, and then he just waves to the crowd as he burns to death. Perpetua, 200 years later, it's a lady, and she's led into an arena for being a Christian, and they've got these animals attacking her, and finally they send another gladiator in to end her life, but he's afraid to do it, and his hands are shaking, and so she just grabs the sword and guides it to cut her own throat. That's bravery. Or move a little further forward, William Tyndale, the first translator of the Bible into English. He was charged with heresy because he gave the common man a Bible they could actually read that we no longer seem to want to read today for some reason, but that's another sermon. And his final words, spoken with zeal at the stake as he was being burned, was simply, Lord, please open the eyes of King of England. Why does it seem that the followers of Jesus are able to face death better than Jesus? Is Jesus just a wimp? Is he just a weak Christian? No. Here's what it is. Nobody ever faced what Jesus is facing. Throughout his ministry, Jesus constantly, over and over, told others that he was going to die, that he was going to suffer. Just hours ago in the Last Supper, in the upper room, he tells his disciples that death is imminent. But something has come upon him. Something has been revealed to him that causes him now, in this moment, to come undone and plead with the Father, take it away. There has to be another way. And so what is it? Again, that's the question we should be asking. Maybe it's the betrayal by Judas, one of his trusted disciples. Or maybe it's knowing that his best friend Peter was going to deny him not once but 3 times. Or maybe it's the shame of people spitting upon the face of the Son of God. Or maybe it's the crown of thorns. Or maybe it's the ridicule as King of the Jews. Or maybe it's that Satan is just hounding him and laughing at him. Or maybe it is the physical pain of the cross. Or maybe it's death itself, the finality of his life on earth. And yes, all of those things are horrific. And yes, all of those things are the wrong answers. Here it is. My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. It's the cup. And you guys are like, oh, well, that really clears things up, Brian. Thanks. In the Old Testament, if we go back, the cup is God's punishment. It's God's wrath and justice. In Isaiah 51, it's called the cup of fury, the cup of anger. Ezekiel 23, it's the cup of ruin, the cup of desolation. Zechariah 12, a cup of tearing and staggering. The cup is the divine infinite wrath of God. It is the wage of sin. And Jesus was to experience the unbounded fury, ruin, and disintegration for the sins of those who came before him, for the sins of those who were with him, and for the sins of all who would come after him. And I know we don't like that kind of language in the church. Or let me rephrase that. Brian doesn't like that kind of language in the church. But I think what is unique, at least I think about this particular church, is we are a very open and loving church. As Sarah said earlier, it's come as you are and be loved. We're a church that is grace upon grace upon grace, where all are loved and all are accepted. But to understand that kind of love and that kind of acceptance, we can't shy away from the reasons that boundless love and grace is available to us. What does God's punishment and wrath look like? Well, it may not be what you think. God's punishment is simply to give people what they want. C.S. Lewis writes in The Great Divorce, and Sarah and David are learning, there is not a sermon I don't think that I give that I don't have a C.S. Lewis quote. So his books have meant a lot to me. Anyway, he writes, there are only 2 kinds of people in the end. Those who say to God, thy will be done. And those to whom God says in the end, thy will be done. We were created by God to live in God's presence. We need that presence or we die to an eternity in hell absent of God, in ruin and desolation. At home, we have a garden. We actually have multiple gardens. And this winter, as we were planting the gardens, we had a bed that was open at the end. And I said, let's plant some potatoes because they're already growing in our pantry right now. And so I think if you just cut these things in half and stick them in the ground, they'll grow. And in a few months, we'll have garlic mashed potatoes. And sure enough, that is how it works. But I'll show you on here, and it's really not a good picture. It's just the one that I have. But, these are like some wildflowers and tomatoes and stuff that I don't eat, and kale and all this, more stuff I don't eat. Potatoes I do eat. On that side of the potato garden are the potatoes coming up. And as you move this way, you see they're kind of thin and sparse. It's because as the sun comes up, that side of the garden box, on that side of the lot, it stays shaded. And so the potatoes that are kind of there in the shade, and they don't grow very well, they don't produce very well, and they're little bitty tiny potatoes when they do. And so a few weeks back, summer's coming. Summer is not a great time to be a gardener in Florida. It's too much work. And so we covered up the gardens. And we just take black tar paper and we roll it over top the gardens. We staple it down. And we remove the sun completely from the gardens. And the thought is it kills the plants. It kills the weeds. Nothing can survive when there is no light. See, when you remove the light from the garden boxes, everything disintegrates and it dies. Even the weeds disintegrate and die, even if they try to kind of crawl out of there. And so they die. And so it's no matter how much fertilizer we put on those plants, if they're in the dark under that cover, they're going to die. No amount of water that we give to those plants is going to make them grow there in the darkness. No matter how good of a plant they were to all the other little plants around them, they're still going to die. No matter how well they treated the other plants or how much service they did or how many times they went to church without light, they're still going to die. John chapter 1, verse 1, one of my favorite scriptures. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Through him all things were made, and him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. Satan, since Genesis chapter 3, has worked us to convince us that we would be happier in the dark, that we would be happier away from the light. Man, I'd be happier if I could just do what I wanted to do and not listen to God. Man, turn the other cheek. That's just dumb. Move to the darkness. Love your enemies. Pray for those who hurt you. Don't lie. Don't cheat. Share everything in common. What is this, communism? This is stupid. Move further and further away from God and into the darkness and away from the light. But in what I can best describe as divine poetic justice, those who don't want God in their lives, they get what they ask for. And as a result, in that darkness, they wilt, they disintegrate, and they die. That's God's divine wrath. That's the wage of sin. And so Jesus has shown that. He's shown that cup of suffering, the removal of God's presence, the removal of God's life on a scale that we simply can't imagine, because from eternity past, Jesus has been with the Father. He's been with the Spirit. He's experienced the presence, fullness of God, their glory, their light. Jesus knows what it's like to be in the full presence of God, the full glory of God, the full light of God, the full love of God. And so this trembling, this sweating of blood, this pleading with the Father, it's not an expression of fear for physical pain or fear of physical death. It's the horror of one who has had the perfect light of God, knowing that upon the cross the Father was going to turn his face away. He was going to remove his presence and his light as he bared the weight of the wages of our sin that we deserved. And as he bore that weight, he would do it for the first time in his life completely and utterly alone. I don't know when, I don't know how, but somewhere along this journey, Jesus has been given a preview, a taste of that cup. And when he's given that taste, he comes undone, he falls to his knees, and he pleads with the Father, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me." But then those words, "Yet not as I will, but as you will." Verse 40, then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. "Couldn't you men keep watch with me for 1 hour?" he asked Peter. These are Jesus' closest friends on earth, 3 of them. Talked about him last week. Peter, he's given keys to the kingdom. "On this rock I will build my church." That's Peter. John, the disciple that Jesus loved. And of course, John makes sure we know that throughout his gospel. James, I don't really know much about James, but he must be a friend of Jesus because he's one of the 3. He's there, and he was there on the mountain last week that Sarah talked about. And so these 3 guys, all of them, they have been saying to Jesus, "Jesus, I'll go to the end with you." And here we are at the end, and they've failed him. They've fallen asleep when he needs them most. And here's what's interesting to me, is Jesus doesn't hide the hurt. He's honest with them. "Could you not keep watch for 1 hour? I need you. I don't want to be alone right now. You let me down. I am a conflict avoider." Any other conflict avoiders in the room? Yeah, my friends let me down. What do? I just bury it deep down inside, and I let it grow, and it turns into bitterness, and it turns into resentment, and eventually, Karen has experienced this around some people, it explodes, and I go all Will Smith on them, and it's just verbally, not physically. Satan wants us to keep things in the dark because he knows nothing grows in the dark, nothing changes in the dark. Jesus knows the more we bring relational hurt into the light, the better that hurt has a chance of growing and healing. Verse 41, he says, watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Jesus knows the flesh is weak. That's why our friends let us down. I mean, it's guaranteed they're going to because the flesh is weak. That's why you let your friends down, because your flesh is weak. And it's not an excuse, but it is a reality. And so that's why we don't put our faith in flesh. Your parents, your siblings, your preacher, your favorite politician, and yes, your BFF, they are real people with their own shortcomings, and they will let you down. And the sooner that you can come to terms with this truth, the easier it is to forgive them and move forward in love. Verse 42, he went away a second time and prayed. Jesus goes back to his friends. They let him down. And so where does he turn? He goes back to his Father. Our friends may love us. They may be well-meaning. They even may be willing, but they're flesh. And when we can't count on anyone else, Jesus knows that he can count on his Father. And so he returns, my Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done. Now, we just get that snippet, but I'm sure that's not all that was said. It's the same prayer that he's repeating from the first time. And that's kind of unexpected, I think, from Jesus, because it's not what I picture the strong and powerful and mighty Jesus to be like. I mean, this is the one who cast out demons. This is the one who caused the blind to see. He spoke at a dead man's grave, and the guy got up and walked away. He fed the multitudes with 5 loaves and 2 fish. He turned water into a fine Chianti, and now he's here, and he's pleading with God the same prayer. He's begging God. I don't know about you, but this is actually a Jesus I relate with pretty well. It's the human side of Jesus, doing a very human thing, admitting, this ain't the way I'd write this story, God. Being honest about his hurt, that he doesn't want to bear with what God is going to bestow upon his life. You can't be betrayed by your friends and not hurt. You can't be raised in a broken home and not hurt. You can't learn about your child who is struggling and not hurt. You can't go through divorce and not hurt. You can't watch a loved one die and not hurt. You can't see all the injustices in this world and not hurt. And so Jesus prays, Father, I'm hurting. My soul is aching. I can't do this. I don't want this. Take it away. Verse 43, when he came back, he again found his friends sleeping, because their eyes were heavy. So he left them and went once more and prayed a third time, saying the same thing. God, help me. Don't let this happen. Not like this. Not my child, not my family, not my cancer. God, I'm so confused. Take this away. This isn't the story I have written. How could this be your plan? How many times have our plan and God's plan been out of sync? How many times have you questioned God or even simply questioned his existence at all because of what you see in your life? And that's what makes the word that Jesus repeats each time he prays so significant. And that word, nevertheless. Nevertheless. It's a word of surrender. He's surrendering to the will of God. There are 2 struggles in life. That song we sang earlier, there's 2 struggles in life that kind of keep God from being the king of our heart that we so much want him to be. Struggle number 1 is our battle with evil. It's the battle from within. And so we wrestle with evil. It's what Paul writes when he says, I do the things I do not want to do. But that second battle is a battle with God. It's a battle with God's will. There is something that God wants me to do, but I don't want to do it. There's a place that God has me right now, but I don't want to be in it. And so in my humble opinion, the battle with evil is actually easier than the battle with God. If you remember Jesus a few weeks ago, he's in the wilderness. He's being tempted by Satan. He's at his lowest of low, fasting and weak. But 3 times, he's really easily able to push Satan away from him. But this battle with God in the garden seems a lot more difficult. He just keeps praying the same prayer. He keeps pleading with the Father, so much that drops of blood begin to fall from his face. When we wrestle with evil, we can count on God to help us. But who do we call upon when our struggle is actually with that God? We just surrender. That's what Jesus does. We give up. We say, nevertheless, I don't understand. I don't get this. Not my will, but yours. It's fine to tell God exactly what you want. Scripture teaches us that. You can go to God. You can ask with specificity. Career direction, tell God what you want. College acceptance, tell him where you want to go. Harvard, if that's where you want to go. Health outcome, God, I am tired of this. I don't want to have this. Get rid of it. You can pray to God for a non-windy day so you can go out on the boat and you can ask him to give you 2 grouper and 10 snapper. You can be that specific. But in the end, in our hearts and with our words, it needs to be nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Jesus possessed the power to remove this cup. If Jesus had insisted upon his will, he could have called down 12 legions of angels, that's 72,000 angels, by the way, to fight a holy war on his behalf. All he had to do was say the word, skip the sacrifice, trade away the cross. But had he done so, there'd be no church. In fact, all of human history would have come to a halt, and we would have disintegrated and died in darkness. The story of Gethsemane, if you really think about it, is the story of an unanswered prayer. Jesus prayed to God to remove the cup, and God doesn't. Why? Because the cup was the reason Jesus came in the first place. Philip Yancey, and if you want a great book to read for this Lent season, especially the 2 weeks leading to Easter, it's one of my absolute favorites. It's called The Jesus I Never Knew, but Yancey writes this. He says, "Here is the man whom loves his enemies, the man whose righteousness is greater than that of the Pharisee, who being rich became poor, who gives his robe to those who took his cloak, who prays for those who despitefully use him. The cross is not a detour or a hurdle on the way to the kingdom, nor is it even the way to the kingdom. The cross is the kingdom come." Consider this. Consider the timing of God revealing the cup to Jesus and giving him this preview. I mean, in this moment, they've had the Last Supper. They've left. Jesus is taught on the way to the garden. They get to the garden. He's going to go pray to the Father one last time before he goes to the cross. So why doesn't God just allow this one last epic prayer? Or maybe one more beautiful moment like up on the mountain, or one more beautiful moment like the baptism where the Father and the Son and the dove and the Holy Spirit are all there. It's, oh. John 10:18, "No one can take my life from me," Jesus says. "I sacrifice it voluntarily." Those words are important. See, once on the cross, there would be no turning back. But here in the garden, the soldiers haven't arrived. There's not been a trial. There's no nails in his hands and feet holding him to the cross. There's still time for Jesus to save himself. There's still time for him to change his mind. And so God gives him a preview of the cup. He shows Jesus how much he is going to suffer. He shows him the full weight of his wrath. And Jesus sees this preview, and with his soul being crushed by the weight, he pauses. And he goes out to find solace with his closest friends for a moment. And what are those friends doing? They're sleeping. They're failing him. And so in the garden, Jesus has shown how much he will suffer. He's given a taste of God's forsakenness. And he's shown the kind of lukewarm, unreliable misfits he's going to suffer for. He could still leave. He could still back out. There's still time. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And so after hours of excruciating, soul-breaking prayer, Jesus' will and the Father's will converge. Verse 45 says, Then he returned to the disciples and said to them, Are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour has come, and the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. And then these powerful words, Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer. Let me be clear. The battle for our salvation, our atonement, that was won at Golgotha, at the cross, where Jesus washed away our sins with his blood. But that choice was made at the garden, where Jesus said, I'd rather go through hell for Brian than to live in heaven without him. Jesus made that choice for me, right there in the garden. And he made that choice for you. And so we sang that new song earlier, Get Drenched in That Love, Get Lost in the Love. That's what we're singing about. Letting that kind of love permeate our being. Letting it amaze you. Meditating day and night how wonderful that news is. Because when we do that, that's where we find peace. That's where our souls, no matter how crushed they are, can find healing. That's when our prayers can have power, when we can surrender and say, Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. I'm going to ask the band to come up because I want to sing and close tonight with an opportunity to surrender. I mean, that's really been the theme, I think, that's kind of, as I've written this sermon, has twisted its way throughout the entire message. It's surrender. It's both the surrender of Jesus that we see, and it's our surrender. And I asked the guys earlier, what's the sign of surrender? Like if I'm like, hey, I'm a police officer, put them up. Like, okay, yeah, a few of you know. Do that, please. I mean, it's dangerous if you don't. But, I mean, that's a sign of surrender. The cops catch the bad guy. You say, I give up. I'm tired of running. I'm tired of fighting. You win. Don't shoot. But where else do you see somebody put their hands up like that? Mom, Dad, pick me up. Lift me. Hold me. And so as we close tonight, I don't care if you raise your hands, you don't raise your hands, but I just ask as we sing this song, just allow surrender to be on your heart. That you take some time as we sing and think of Christ's surrender. Think of your surrender or what you need to surrender right now in your life. And if you see those around you raising their hands, that's awesome. It's a sign of surrender, letting go. And if you're comfortable, this is a safe place to do that. But as we sing tonight, think of surrender. Let's stand as we sing.